I'm Doug Fern, and this is my take on music recording. DSD is an alternative digital audio recording format that offers amazing audio quality at a price of some restrictions compared to the way we are accustomed to recording. That has prevented its widespread adoption as the next level of music recording. In this episode, I continue my conversation with George and Geoff Hazelrigg as we discuss our experience with working with DSD in the studio. Occasionally, we each record material in traditional PCM digital, such as for this podcast. But otherwise, the three of us have adopted DSD as our standard recording format. Our conversation is informal and covers more than just our enthusiasm for DSD. We avoid technical details as much as possible. Looking at DSD at that level will be the subject of a future podcast episode. The technology of recording has really gone through an interesting evolution over the last 150 years. And you say, 150 years, really? And it is close to 150 years because they've been able to retrieve audio from experiments that were done in France using basically the same thing as they used for making the original disc, acoustic discs, but it was just used to essentially draw a line in a sheet of paper that had carbon on it so you could see the waveforms. And they were not interested in recording the sound. They were interested in evaluating what the waveforms look like. Mm-hmm. It's very clever. And when people came across this stuff, they realized that maybe there's a way to play that back and convert it back into audio, which they did, and it actually works.
Yeah, I heard those recordings that you sent, and it's surprising how much information there is in there. There are some artifacts that take your attention away from the core audio, but it did work.
Yeah, it did work, but it took a whole lot of work. They had to have a lot of clever people figuring out how to compensate for all the deficiencies in the process to actually make it playable. But when you listen to it, it's obviously awful sounding, but that's pretty amazing for the 1850s.
Yeah, considering that was the first time it ever happened.
Right.
Yeah.
Then, of course, we went to the phonograph record, which acoustic form lasted for another 30 years, 40 years, to electrical recording. Same process, still mechanical. It's a record, with a groove you can see the waveform in if you look at it closely. Mm-hmm. Then there was this transition to magnetic tape, which was a huge benefit. But tape has its own, just like almost insurmountable drawbacks. And then, of course, we went to digital. And it was interesting to me that Bell Labs in the 1920s and 30s figured out everything about digital audio. All the fundamentals they had figured out. No way to actually put it into practical use or even experimental use, but they knew all the principles.
Right.
Nyquist was a Bell Labs engineer, and they published all this stuff. And because Bell Labs was part of a regulated monopoly, all this stuff was basically public domain. So other people could utilize what they learned. But the phone company actually had the first digital audio telephone circuits in use in the early 1950s. And that was made possible by the invention of the transistor. But it still took another, 50 years till digital audio for quality sound recording really eclipsed entirely the analog world, even though there are still people that use analog tape recorders. And I think that's great that they still do that. But along the way, I think we gained here, we lost there, this was better, this got worse. And it all just kept changing, and obviously not always for the better. And I believe it was Bell Labs, one of the other major research labs, that came up with two different recording technologies for digital audio. One of them was PCM, pulse code modulation, which is the one we're most familiar with. Mm-hmm. It's basically all the formats that we use. And they also came up with DSD, although they didn't call it DSD. It had a different name. But it was the same principle. And that laid buried for, 70 years or something, until I guess it was Sony, and probably others too, but Sony was the one that really decided to see what could be done with DSD. And that was a revelation to a lot of people, just how good that sounded. Mm-hmm. So DSD sort of made a little bit of an impact early on. When was that first Sony system? Do you remember what year?
Not precisely, but it was 20 years ago.
Yeah, maybe more than that even.
Yeah.
Late 90s maybe?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Interestingly enough, right, that system was worked on by the same people who developed the CD, like Andreas Koch, that we, I don't know, is it Koch or Koch? I don't know how he pronounces his.
Koch, I think.
Yeah, okay. We were on that panel at the NAMM show a couple of years ago. Mm-hmm. And he explained that whole thing. Actually, that was a fascinating thing, because I think he knows more about that stuff than anybody. Mm. He designed the first PCM converter for CD players before he went on to do this DSD thing.
Yeah.
Yeah. And had a very eloquent presentation on why DSD is so superior to the PCM system.
Yeah. Yeah, I hope to get him on a podcast at some point.
Yeah, it'd be a good idea.
Yeah. Because I don't think anybody knows more about it than he does. It was actually you guys that introduced me to the improved quality of DSD, because I was aware of it, and some of my customers had that Sony Sonoma system and raved about it. And I heard some of the stuff that they did. Of course, what I listened to was a conversion to PCM,
right? But
it still sounded pretty amazing. But tell us how you got into that.
Oh, wow.
Well, before, back in the late 90s, we were living in the Washington, D.C. area. We were working on a number of different projects, and we got introduced to a mastering engineer there, Charlie Pilzer. He became sort of a recording mentor of ours for a few years. And
sort of still is, actually.
Yeah. Helped us with mixing, helped us understand the mastering process a bit, and directed us toward different technologies and things that he thought we might be interested in. And one of the pieces was Korg. I think it was Korg had recently come out with some small DSD recorder. That was the first thing we'd ever heard of DSD. I don't even remember any specs on it.
It was a MR1000. They had a 2000, which was a rack mount unit.
Yeah,
I think.
How many channels was that?
Just stereo.
Maybe just some kind of handheld device or something.
You talking about the one that we got?
Well, it predates the one that we owned.
Oh, right. Okay, there was one that was.
And he was like, all the classical people are going nuts over this.
Well, he had a Tascam machine that was capable.
Oh, that's right.
Like what's the 1000?
It's like a DVD writer or something like that.
Yeah, right. And it was
Yeah. So anyhow, Charlie introduced us to that. We're always sort of trying to do the next best thing. If you're using one sample rate and you can step it up, we're always trying to step it up. So eventually we actually bought one of these small Korg machines.
It was an MR1000, I think.
That's what it is. You're right.
Yeah, and it would run on batteries for about 20 minutes or something like that. But it was like an onboard hard drive that would record several hours worth of DSD, and it was 5.6 megahertz, so it's two times speed.
And sound quality wise, compared to, I don't know, the Motu converter we were using at the time or something, it was night and day difference.
Well, I remember we bought it specifically to record Art of the Fugue, which we did. It was a 2 harpsichord arrangement that Gavin Black and I had done for Bach's Art of the Fugue, which is a piece that wasn't written for any particular instrument, But a lot of keyboardists like to perform this piece. I mean, it's a piece. It's an hour and 15 minutes worth of fugues. And we bought it specifically for that because harpsichords are horrible to try to record. There's so much transient high-end information. I mean, as we know, it's really hard to handle. And we thought this would be a good bet. And we ordered the machine, and I pulled it out of the box and put headphones on, and it had a demo on it, some demo recording, and I hit play, and my head spun around. I just got dizzy. I couldn't believe what I was hearing.
How would you describe the difference?
It didn't give me a headache. The dynamics moved in such a way that my body physically reacted to that it was just a great experience. I mean, I wasn't an expensive pair of headphones. It's running off the headphone amp and built into the box. It was just the format and how they recorded it. It was just amazing. So Geoff wound up engineering that Art of the Fugue CD with it. That was our first.
Yeah, and we used it on a number of different, to mix down as a mix down deck for projects. Like I remember I don't remember what the project was, but I remember going to a mastering session at Charlie's with that unit. I mean, it made the whole process easier because I think we just took the audio out of the unit and fed it into his system, and it's like just mixing down to that was a step closer to sort of perfect recording.
Well, I remember we mixed a record at Phil Nicolo's place, and he was intrigued by it and wanted to...
That's right. We had 5 or 6 different mix down...
Captures, yeah.
Actually, comparisons. And one of them was the direct... We listened to the direct out of the SSL 4000 through the Tascam DSD recorder. He had a... Did we run a tape machine also?
Yeah, we ran a tape machine. I can't remember what the deck was.
Yeah, and then he had a Prism sound converter.
Right.
He had the Pro Tools HD converters.
Right.
I don't know. There may have been 1 or 2 other options in there. And everyone was astounded.
Yeah, in fact, if I remember correctly, Phil's comment about it was that it even sounded better than the direct signal off the board, which we couldn't understand. Somehow...
Or it was very, nearly indiscernible.
Yeah, I mean, and remember, back then, that Prism converter was an expensive box. I mean, probably the most expensive 2-channel converter you could, get. And there was no comparison. I mean, it sounded like it was broken next to the DSD.
Yeah. Yeah, I think we should point out it's probably not the fault of the hardware, it's the fault of the digital concept of recording.
Oh, absolutely.
Right.
Yeah.
DSD, and I'm not going to go into the technical details. For one thing, I don't think I could explain it accurately enough, and we'll get somebody that can for a future episode. But, people say it sounds more like analog, which I think is a valid sort of first approximation of the difference.
Sure.
But there's just something about, and it's not even transparency or anything like that. It has to do with the lack of annoying artifacts.
Right.
Is my impression.
Yeah.
Right. And, one of the arguments that I hate the most about either going higher sample rates or I almost personally classify DSD as sort of different from comparing sample rates because DSD, our PureMix records at 11.2 megahertz, but to compare that to 192K, I think it's sort of apples and oranges. It's not quite the same thing.
Right.
But the biggest annoyance that I get from arguments is, well, your hearing doesn't go past, say 16K, so all that extended frequency stuff you don't hear that, which I don't disagree with. It's just all that stuff missing on or getting clear on the top end, it clears everything on the bottom end. It's the clarity that you get out of the stuff. It's the stuff in the 1K range that sounds better.
Well,
right.
Yeah, I was talking about this with my father actually just a week ago, and who's an engineer, not not an audio engineer. He's like he's an actual engineer.
Like rocket scientist.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
He was talking about using Fourier transforms to analyze foldback aliasing problems.
Mm-hmm.
And so, I mean, how does that relate to us? So if you look at the wagon wheel and it's turning, and all of a sudden it slows down and stops and moves backwards, that's aliasing.
Right.
Now, that is...
You're talking about in a movie or a video.
Yeah, sure, right, yeah. That is a low-frequency distortion that is caused by a high-frequency issue, right? Because the wagon wheel's moving very fast, and your frame rate is very fast. And so it's the difference that's there and that create the error that gives you a frequency. I mean, if that wagon wheel's turning at, I don't know, what's a wheel spin at, 800 RPM, it's probably not that
That's
fast.
probably a fast wheel.
I don't think it's that fast.
But you know,
even if it's 100,
yeah, sure.
and you're basically have a 24 frame per second sample rate,
Right.
then you can't capture it. You can't capture every instance of that rotation.
Right. So then it slows down and stops and then turns backwards. Now you're seeing a wave that's 5 cycles or less per second, maybe 1 cycle per second,
Right.
Or less. So when this happens in audio, that dumps it right down into your low mid range there, in the place that everybody says, okay, well, you know, I've got whatever 80 tracks of audio here. The first thing I like to do is high pass filter it at 100 hertz. Why? You ever ask why? Because there's lots of stuff down there that's pretty musical that you don't really want to throw the baby out with the bathwater.
Right.
And in a lot of these cases, you sort of have to, because you know you've got these annoying frequencies that aren't natural. They don't add anything positive to the experience. And when we record DSD, we just don't have that problem.
Well, I think it's important to understand that PCM sample rate is totally different from a DSD sample rate, because DSD is an entirely different way of capturing the audio. And again, I'm not going to go into the technical details, but you know, it's actually very similar to the way the pulse width modulator and the VT7 compressor works. You know, that's without going into detail again, but the idea is that you can chop up audio into tiny segments fast enough that you can't hear it. I mean, way faster than you can hear.
Right.
You would think you can't reconstruct that into audio anymore, but it's just like so many of these little bits, and they're not bits in the usual sense.
Right.
You know, the audio is preserved without those PCM kinds of artifacts. And I think point about the mid-range, I mean, I mostly hear it in the 300, 400 hertz range. That's where I find it most annoying in PCM. And I think that's why a lot of people do that kind of scoop DQ.
Right.
You know, to get rid of that, because what's bothering them are those artifacts that are building up in that range. You know, you can do all kinds of traditional measurements of distortion, frequency response, noise, all those kinds of things that we use to, you know, specify what the audio quality is likely to be, and they won't show that.
Right.
With any recorder I've ever worked with, one test that is totally revealing is to put a pure sine wave, and I'm talking about a really pure sine wave, derived from an analog source. Because if it's a digitally derived sine wave, then it's not really truly a sine wave. But a true analog, real low distortion sine wave into any recorder, and listen to it and compare it to the original sound. And although it's kind of annoying to listen to a pure sine wave, it is revealing of just how bad all of our recording systems sound that way. But you do that with DSD, and it's not perfect, but it's a whole lot closer.
Yeah. Well, there's another aspect with DSD that I find is really the clincher, and that is with the analog systems, when you're going to extremes in dynamics, you'll get a much different tone at the top end than you will at the bottom, in terms of power.
Mm-hmm.
And in PCM digital, you've got, if you're sort of closer to 0 dB, you'll have more bits to represent your waveform, your sound, than if you drop it down to, say, minus 50 dB, something really low. And with DSD, those tones stay exactly the same.
Right. It's the same all the way down to the noise floor.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah, I learned that when the first read-write CD players came out. And I did an experiment where I took a recording, something I had done that was, I thought was really high quality, analog on tape. And I recorded it to CD. And then I recorded it like 5 times, each time dropping the level by 10 dB,
Mm-hmm.
and comparing the sound of it and cranking it up the monitor volume in between. You have to be very careful with this.
Right.
And just listening, I mean, even when you get to minus 10, it starts to get grungy.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
And by minus 50, it's hardly recognizable as
Right.
music.
Yeah.
Right.
You
I
know?
remember I mixed a project for a friend of mine it was a real artsy project, and the tracks were there was just terrible engineering that went into it. And I don't remember what they recorded it to. It may have been an 8-ad or something, but the levels were really low, so I had to crank them up. And it was exactly like you threw them through one of those bit crushing plugins.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it sounded just like that.
Well, that is what it
Yeah.
is.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
So that's the low end of your dynamic range with PCM,
Right.
That's what you got.
Yeah, and I think people in our business tend to disregard how important that low-level content really is.
Mm-hmm.
That information down there in the minus 50, minus 60, you think you don't hear it, but it makes a huge difference in how you hear that sound,
Mm-hmm.
because that's where all the subtleties of the music lie. That's where the subtleties of a vocal lies. That's where the subtleties of a room sound would lie. Or your reverb, even your artificial reverb,
Sure.
All that stuff just turns to mush.
Mm-hmm. So the only way to compensate for this is by squashing it with a compressor. And this has become a thing. I mean, when I was in school, I remember one of my professors saying, the quickest way to ruin a recording is by using too much compression.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, to think that that's what we were taught back then versus what students are taught now, where it's like, okay, well, I've got 27 compressors on 30 tracks here, and then I've got 2 compressors on the mix bus, and, and some drum subgroup compression, and what this is how we compensate for a lot of this stuff.
That's right. Yeah, and that same approach applied to the world of tape too, because you were dealing with a very limited dynamic range, a lot of noise, and tape does not sound good, especially in the high registers, when it gets close to 0 on the meter.
Right.
So you use compressors to keep the level up above the noise and keep it from getting too high and distorting. A lot of those habits have persisted for different reasons into digital recording. But DSD, you don't need to do that.
Yeah, so then well, first of all, I should start out by saying all music, I say this all the time, is completely dependent on technology. Every bit of music you've ever experienced or anybody's ever experienced has been a product of technology one way or another.
Right.
I mean,
Except for the voice.
Well, right, except for the voice.
Yeah. But yeah, you're right. I mean, all the instruments are technology.
Yeah, everything. I mean, from the time that some, Neanderthal stretched a deer skin over a hollow log, that's technology. And once that thing exists, you're going to get music that's written for it. I grew up playing harpsichord, and I played a lot of Bach, and there was a lot of Bach repertoire for harpsichord, and people were always like, well, I mean, if Bach had a piano, then it would sound like, he would have played a sol and piano. No, he wouldn't have. He would have written different music because the piano didn't produce music like that. It produced music like, Beethoven and Rachmaninoff. Mm-hmm. Recording medium, I mean, it's the same thing. It's an instrument. And, we record what works well in that format, in whatever format we're working in. When the CD came out, I remember the classical people thinking, this is going to be great. This is really what classical music needs because it's got clarity and blah, blah, blah. And 5 years later, that was the end of classical music because it wasn't good for that format at all. Analog was suited much better for that format. Now, what is suited for that format is more electronic types of music. And when the MP3 became the standard, everybody was blaming the MP3 for being a lousy format. I actually don't think the MP3 is a lousy format. We've done a lot of converting DSD files into MP3, and it sounds pretty good.
Yeah. Well, I think that's an important point, that the DSD capture is rarely going to get to the ultimate listener. We can enjoy it, ourselves, but it's not a consumer format that's widely available.
But it doesn't have to.
I know, because what happens when you convert that to PCM, to a WAV file, or, even worse, to an MP3, a huge amount of that improvement persists through that, which is something I don't understand. I don't have an explanation for that.
I do.
Yeah?
It's the lack of artifacts. And I think that the bulk of those artifacts comes in the capture process. So when you're capturing something at, on a converter at 44.1, we're getting these wagon wheel problems. When you capture into a, DSD converter, a Delta Sigma converter, you're not getting that right off the bat. And when you file convert that stuff, you're not dealing with those problems.
Yeah, there's still something about it that baffles me, because as far as the PCM version is concerned, it doesn't know whether it's coming off your analog preamps or from an A to D converter or D to A converter. So as far as that's concerned, it's a similar process. I think there's more to it. I think what you're saying, there's definitely that. Anytime you can avoid any kind of conversion, the better off it's going to sound.
Sure, yeah. But
there's something else about it that I do not know how to explain.
Well, it's a mystery, and the problem is there's not enough of us out there using the format in the ways that we do to be able to give us enough feedback. I mean, I have talked to other engineers who agree that if you capture in DSD and then file convert, you're retaining most of the benefits of the format.
Right. Yeah. I mean, that's been my experience too. Even on projects, because I only have the capability to record 8 tracks of DSD, if I need more tracks, I go to convert it to PCM and then overdub on that, making sure I got all the most important stuff in the DSD capture.
Right.
It still makes a difference.
Mm-hmm.
It still sounds really, really good.
We had a funny experience, I guess you would call it, where the Pyramix system sounds excellent. It's really an excellent system. It is frustrating to work with. We all know this. It just decides to unravel itself at times, which means that you're down for some period of time or on with tech support, and those guys are always good. But we were having to record a piece for a podcast that wound up being used as their theme song, and they wanted us to redo a song that we had previously recorded. And that week, we had a new converter come in from those guys, and it just wouldn't run in DSD. And so we did the same recording, same group, same mics, nothing had moved. it just we used the same converter to record at, what did we do it at? Probably would have done it at 96.
I think 96.
Yeah, 882 or 96.
Mm-hmm.
It's usually as high as we go when we do PCM recordings. And we played some of it back, and my first instinct was like, wow, I mean, our rig sounds really good. And then there was this little feeling in the pit of my stomach that something was wrong. Mm-hmm. And then I felt kind of upset about it because everything else was the same. The converter itself was the same. It was the same machine. It was just in PCM mode instead of DSD mode. And something serious was lost in the recording. And, you know, we got to this whole thing because, we got to this point because we were really trying to get our trio to sound good recorded. I was never happy with the feeling of what we were getting out of it, you know, and we would play live and people would be like, oh my God, this is great, you know. And I never got the feeling, you know, that feeling coming back on recorded music until we got using multi-track DSD stuff. And sure enough, I mean, by this point, this was sometime maybe a year ago or so, it was totally apparent that something was missing when we had to drop it back to PCM. And ultimately, at the other end, it was PCM anyway. Mm-hmm. The only place where we made a change was at the actual point of capture.
Yeah. Well, I think we need to, now that we've got people perhaps interested in this, we have to point out that DSD is not without its downsides. And one of the biggest problems is that you cannot mix at this stage of technology, you cannot mix DSD in its native format, which means that unless you can do something, you know, that's never going to need to be converted to PCM, it will stay in a DSD format straight to the listener, there's always going to be a conversion to PCM for mixing, or if you need to do any processing to it or anything like that. That would appear to be a major downfall of the format. But I think we've made the point that if you capture it in DSD, you can get away with a lot. That PCM conversion to do your, if you have to, EQ, compression, that sort of thing, you'll still be ahead.
There's a whole world of people out there recording classical music. If you're recording classical music, I mean, that's typically 2-track. Well, I mean, I guess it depends on what you're doing, but...
Yeah, I think a lot of people make classical records now that are like a rock session. You know?
Yeah. Mm.
But you're right. In its purest form, it's basically 2-track.
Yeah. I mean, and in that scenario, it's not any harder to deal with than anything else. And it's just unbeatable. I mean, I wouldn't bother recording any other way. Which actually brought us to the point where we got really interested in single point recording too. Mm-hmm. So, you know, we go out with 2-track DSD recorder and a stereo microphone like an R88. If you spend the time getting everything set up in your room with the musicians and everybody's balanced and you don't have to do a lot of editing, or at least editing you can do linear editing. That's easy to do. But there are people out there doing these types of recordings and they're spectacular.
Well, remember we did that video with Tom McIntyre.
Right.
And I'll put the link to that if anybody's interested in taking a look and listen to that. It's on YouTube, so the audio is not pristine, but you can still hear a significant difference between the PCM version and the DSD version, which is not, in this particular example, is not exact comparison because the DSD version uses a single stereo mic for everything. The other one, the PCM version, uses multiple mics. But just that single point pickup just has a solidness to it.
You know? Yeah, it's a good representation of what you can do with just that single microphone.
Right.
Yeah.
Something else that was interesting came out of that for me.
Yeah.
I was listening back and forth between those two versions right before we released the video. And I had to talk to Cookie Marenko about this, and she said, oh, yeah, you noticed that. There was a line that he sang, and I was listening to the PCM version, and I thought, oh, wow, that's out of tune. And I stopped, and I thought, I don't remember that being out of tune. Mm-hmm. And I went back and I listened to the DSD version. And subjectively, I could tell that the pitch wasn't tuned with, whatever. It wasn't tuned the way we would think of it, something being perfectly in tune. But it didn't sound out of tune to me at all. And I called Cookie and she said, oh yeah, we notice that all the time. And if you look at, the music industry after about 2000, right, when all the records went into Pro Tools, along came auto-tune, and all of a sudden everything was tuned. And there was the auto-tune part of it, and then there was, what's the plugin we used to use in Pro Tools to straighten drums out? Beat Detective.
Oh, right.
And I think that everything had to be edited to be perfectly in tune and perfectly in time for the benefit of the format, that it doesn't give you leeway somehow with those parameters it won't reproduce things that are that sophisticated. And, you look at, back to writing and, recording music for the technology. With MP3 came Skrillex, right? And I think Skrillex is brilliant, actually. But his music was absolutely optimized for that format. Mm-hmm. And, of course, he became the biggest thing out there, not surprisingly. And in that same period of time, we saw the end of rock bands. Rock music almost completely went away. Mm-hmm. In terms of the mainstream, what was really selling.
So if DSD were to catch on, how would that change music?
It would change what people choose to record, how they choose to do it. I think there's a lot of culture that would have to revert back to earlier thinking to be able to make the most use of it. But it's certainly, it's not like people don't know how to do this stuff anymore. They're certainly capable of doing it. It's just a matter of choosing to.
Yeah, and we should point out that there are DSD recordings available for the consumer through several outlets, including Blue Coast.
Right.
Despite the fact that most of those have gone through a PCM conversion or two on their way to the listener, I think they still retain a lot of that DSD purity.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, if somebody could figure out how to mix it, and we've talked to a couple people in the last couple of years who say that, given enough funding, they could make it work. And I certainly hope they get the opportunity to do that, because that would change the world.
Well, theoretically, it's certainly possible. I do think it probably would take more funding than those folks have estimated, but it's theoretically possible to do. At one point, if the industry had decided, hey, let's really develop this technology, we would have it now. But the industry moved to center mostly on people who are recording at home, face it, mostly hobbyists. Mm-hmm. And, the big studios started to go away. So there goes the demand for that.
Well, when we did that DSD forum at was AES at NAMM a couple of years ago, we had a pretty good audience, a wide cross-section of people from the industry. Mm-hmm. And I was taken by the fact that a lot of those people were very excited about the concept until they started to realize the shortcomings and how it would have to change everything they did. Mm. Then they sort of walked out and say, that was interesting, and proceeded to forget all about it.
Right.
So that's an obstacle to the format's acceptance.
That's how it is across the board for everything. People don't want to do anything. They find their comfort zone, and that's where they want to live out the rest of their career. We're always trying to make better recordings. That takes work. Mm. Not only does it take some practice to get better on our instruments, but we're always looking for better miking techniques and better converters and better software and better, why? Who doesn't want better things in their life? Oh, my life's good enough. Okay, that's fine. That's good enough for them then. But, for us, we're always trying to do better than what we've previously done.
Yeah. Well, I think all three of us are cursed with that need to find the best possible way to do anything or any kind of equipment we deal with, whether it's recording equipment or cars or airplanes or whatever it is, we're never satisfied.
Right.
You know, and as much as I think we've zeroed in on the kinds of things that make us happy in the recording studio, that doesn't mean we're stopping there. You know, if we come across something else that's better, you know, we'll look into it.
Well, I think there's a fundamental thing about the three of us that we share, and that is, I know there's a lot of people in this business who do it because they love audio and they love music and they love all this stuff. I think we do this because we're irritated.
Yeah. Well, as you guys know, one of my highest compliments on listening to something is it didn't bother me.
Yeah, that's Doug's. This is the highest praise you're ever going to get out of Doug. There's nothing there that bothers me.
Right. But that's really true. I think that for me, and I'm sure it's true for you guys too, is my motivation has always been to get rid of those irritants in my life.
Mm-hmm.
You know, and if it's in the studio or anything else, I just want to find a way to minimize that irritation.
Right, and artifacts are irritating.
Right. And I know there's lots of people that would argue against this, and that's fine. They may well be right. But I really believe that there's a lot of subtle annoyances in music, no matter how you hear it, that influence not only reaction to the music, but your actual well-being at that moment.
I totally believe that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You know, we've gone through, you know, in my lifetime, a whole transition from one type of recording to the next, and generally made progress upward, but not always. And we probably are pretty close to the point where we have the technology to eliminate so many of those irritants. And for people that don't think that matters, I suspect that it does matter, and they just don't know it.
Mm-hmm.
They don't see it in themselves. You know, it used to be when I finished a recording project, a digital recording project, and went home, last thing I wanted to do was listen to it.
Right, right.
And now with DSD, when I get done, I go home, I say, I want to hear that again.
Yeah.
And I'll listen to it like 5 times.
Yeah, yeah.
And it never gets on my nerves. I mean, there may be other things in the recording gets on my nerves,
Yeah.
but it's not the technical quality generally. I always hear things I could have done better. I hear things that the players could have done better. But
yeah, but that's what you should be focused on.
that's right. That's where your focus should be. It shouldn't be on the technology. It should be on the performance of the music and the quality of the capture of the music. But being able to listen to something over and over and over again, to me, is a mark of something that has real low level of irritants.
I think overall, too, you know, looking at recording technologies in general, I think people have lost sight of what a recording is supposed to do for you. You know, like behind the aesthetics of the whole thing. Take a copy of Kind of Blue on vinyl and put it on. Not many people have had that actual experience in this day and age, you know, and turn the lights down or do it at dusk or something, and it sets a mood. It actually does something, you know. It's not like, oh, I just dimmed the lights and I popped my MP3 on of Kind of Blue. It's not the same thing.
Right.
It's a totally different experience, and I don't think people understand that unless they actually experience it. As far as the recording medium is concerned, though, I think we're introducing new aesthetic ideals, new goals, new sights for what recorded audio should convey. It's like, what, you know, why do you take a picture of something? It's like, oh, so I can remember the memory. Well, okay, so I got one of those disposable cameras and I took a picture and I can remember the memory, but the photo looks terrible. You know what I mean? Mm-hmm. And then you go out and you get like the latest, you know, zillion megapixel camera and you take a picture. Okay, they both can show this sort of the same thing. Obviously, you see more details. It's a connection to what you want to see, and, you know, perhaps that fuzzy photo from the disposable camera connected you somehow at some point in time. This is a new world of being able to connect with people and to bridge the gap between, what you're capturing and what, maybe as an artist you're trying to convey through your music or whatever it is you're recording and your audience.
Yeah, whenever this topic comes up and people who've worked with the format use the term feel, well, maybe it doesn't even sound that different, but it makes me feel different. There's a different feel about it. And a lot of guys poo-poo this. They say, oh, well, whatever, you're just being whatever it is.
But a lot of those people don't have that experience of putting on a vinyl copy of Kind of Blue.
Well, that's true. I mean, when you said that, I was thinking about the way the upright bass feels on that record coming off of vinyl. There's something about it that it's totally different. Mm-hmm. It's not a focused, precise sound. It's just something that bumps along, and it does make you feel a certain way. And I think you're speaking to expectations. People, I think they've lost having very deep expectations of what their music should do for them. Mm-hmm. I think that's sad. I think that's the part that we really need to get back to.
Yeah. Well, I think that ties back to what we talked to in the other episode, the earlier one, about, the listener experience and comparing that to the experience of live acoustic music. Let's face it, the majority of people have no experience with music that doesn't come out of a speaker or their earbuds or headphones or something. They don't know what the real music sounds like. And if they would experience that, they'd realize that it's an entirely different place it takes them to, than a lousy recording. So maybe that's kind of summarizes, we want to take the people to that same kind of feeling as they would have sitting in the room with the people. We don't want to duplicate that because that's not necessarily an effective recording.
Right.
But we want to capture that mood. And a big part of that, to me, is eliminating all those irritating aspects of it so that they're not distracting and, your focus can be on what's this person trying to convey to me with their music.
I don't want to sound preachy about this, but I mean, going back to what Geoff was saying, look, I understand this doesn't fit a lot of people's workflow. There's some things you got to work around. It takes you a little bit of time to do file conversions. You got to ask yourself, why are you doing this? Another 10 minutes worth of work? Is that going to be a problem? If it is, I don't know. I think it's going to take a re-examination of priorities.
Well, yeah. I mean, you could extend that to the recording process itself where, something doesn't sound quite right. You have to be motivated to go out there and move that mic, change that mic, change the position of the room, whatever it takes to fix it.
Right. Yeah, not just pass it off to the mix engineer to fix.
Right.
Who's going to pass it off to the mastering engineer to fix?
And as we know from our personal experience, you get it right and everything falls into place. Mm-hmm. It's just an effortless process all the way through.
And fun.
And fun. And I think that's a good point to bring up, George, because all music doesn't necessarily have to be fun, but you at least have to have the impression that the people making that music enjoy what they're doing.
Yeah, oh yeah.
And how many records sound like that? Obviously, there's a lot of them that do, but there's a whole lot more that don't.
Yeah, I was sitting by the pool a couple years ago. It's the public pool my wife and I go to, and they're playing the radio, and it was a lot of pop stuff. This Earth, Wind, and Fire song came on. I think it was September. And all I could do is get the sense that these guys were having so much stinking fun in the studio that they couldn't stand it. I mean, how expensive was that session? To just be in the room that day must have been incredible. You know, to work with that kind of a budget, with that level of talent, with that level of material, and you listen to the song, and that song's as popular or more popular than most things that have been made in the last decade. And a lot of the people who listen to it, I mean, their parents were kids when that came out.
I think that's true. If you, no matter how far back you go in recorded music, the stuff that people still listen to today always has that characteristic.
Mm-hmm.
It's easy to say, you know, like people talk about houses. They don't build them like they used to.
Mm-hmm.
Well, the houses that weren't built very well fell down or got replaced.
Yeah.
But the quality houses are still around, you know, a couple hundred years later. And I think it's the same thing with music. The music that was properly constructed and the people making the music had the right attitude towards it, and everybody in the process believed in it and was enthusiastic about it. That stuff lasts.
Yeah.
You've been listening to my continuing conversation with George and Geoff Hazelrigg as we discuss DSD recording. Thanks for listening, and please subscribe to this podcast using any of the 30-plus podcast providers that carry it. Your reviews help others to find my podcast. You can always reach me personally by email, dwfern@dwfern.com. This is my take on music recording. I'm Doug Fern. See you next time.